This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
October 16, 2010 marked the 15th anniversary of the Million Man March. 15 years ago, perhaps folks could not have imagined having a black president. And that's just one of the many things that has occurred and changed during this 15-year interval. Today, we're joined by Bucknell University Professor James Peterson to talk about the 15 years since the Million Man March, as well as issues around hip-hop, masculinity, homophobia, and bullying. We're also joined by Rashod Ollison, music critic for the Virginian Pilot, to talk about what he's listening to in R&B music today. I'm Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. I'm Anthony Neal, and you're watching Left of Black. We are joined here this afternoon by Professor James Peterson, Professor of English at Bucknell University, author of the forthcoming Major Figures, Repetition, Presence, and Discourse in Hip-Hop Culture. How you doing, James?
Good, sir. How are you?
And of course, you know, you are in a way returning home, 1993 Duke graduate,
right.
Also in the English department. How you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. I love Duke, and I love where you are right now.
We wanted to have you on, and James is going to be also one of our regular contributors to Left of Black, and we wanted to talk about a range of things with you this afternoon. You know, we just celebrated the 15th anniversary of the Million Man March.
Yes.
Did you go to the march?
I did go to the march. I did, and I got to tell you, it was an extraordinary experience. It's interesting because at the moment that I went, I was actually really caught up in the movement and the messaging from the organizers of the march in such a way that I didn't realize the gender critique that was really brought to bear after the march, right? So in the moment I was there, I went with a group of friends from school and from grad school, and we traveled together. And I've been to DC countless times, scores of times. I've never felt that kind of energy in DC. And honestly, I don't think ever again in my life I will be around that many black men with that kind of purpose and that kind of energy in a public event.
When you think about where the conversation was in 1995, Louis Farrakhan is perhaps at his peak in terms of his influence within the black community. In some ways, we're celebrating the possibility of a Colin Powell run for president.
Yes.
In 1996. Michael Jordan is still somewhere as a major icon. Michael Jackson is still an icon in certain kinds of ways. Mike Tyson is returning from jail after his stint, and to a certain extent still an icon.
Yes.
We go 15 years later, and on the one hand, you know, someone had said,
both still alive at that point.
Right, Tupac and Biggie are still alive, right? So it's a very different kind of moment. Yes. 15 years later, you know, some of these people have passed. There's a black president in the White House. You know, what do you think the remaining 15 years since the Million Man March has meant in terms of what that conversation was that day and where black masculinity is thought of in 2010? And as kind of a secondary question, you know, what happened to Farrakhan, you know, over that 15-year period?
Interesting. So on the first piece, I think what I took away from the march itself at that point was the theme of atonement, which I felt like was extremely important in that moment, especially when you think about Mike Tyson as one of the seminal figures of that particular, if you want to count that decade as an era. Right. You know, atonement was really, really important. I think that helped shape in many ways the ways in which Tupac responded to his own rape trial and rape case. Even though it wasn't straight up atonement, he did understand that culpability is not necessarily always about what it is you do. It's also sometimes what you allow to be done. And I think that message got across to certain men within the hip hop generation. So we had atonement. Also, what was really strong was just the sense of being responsible in terms of family. And I really believe that that message got across to a lot of young black men that were there. A lot of my peers and a lot of folk in my community, they're family men. The men that I spend time with and hang out with are married and they have children and they take care of their children. I know we don't get a lot of news media attention. I know that we don't get a lot of pats on the back. I don't think many of us are looking for that, but I do think that the march, it didn't cause that that sort of sense of responsibility and accountability, but it brought it into the national conversation in such a way that a lot of men that were there were charged with taking that accountability back to their communities. And I think if you look back over the last 10, 15 years, that actually has been the case. The third piece that I think is interesting, and maybe the message that we can see the most readable tangibility in, was that the economic empowerment piece. I think what a lot of people remember from the march was two things. One, when Farrakhan actually apologized to the widow of Malcolm X. I mean, that was an extraordinary moment, even for people who didn't really understand the nuances and intricacies of his assassination.
Right, the history of it, right.
Farrakhan's role in it or lack of role in it. The fact that he apologized is the same kind of atonement message that he was really trying to get across. But the economic empowerment piece was big too, because when he told us all to hold those dollars up in the air, even though the Fruit of Islam came around and collected them quickly, before they collected all those dollars, the feeling of economic empowerment in that moment was really, really extraordinary. And if you look around at my peers, you can see, maybe to a fault, that material gain and economic success has continued to be a very, very important measure of manhood and masculinity for my generation. So a lot of those messages, we can't say the march initiated them or caused them or influenced people to act a certain way, but putting those things on the national stage was extraordinary at that moment. And I do think that there's a carryover of values that we can see amongst Black men my age and really younger and older in terms of responsibility and accountability, family, atonement, and economic empowerment.
Let me ask this question about the atonement piece. Our good friend Mark Lamont Hill, recently commented that, it was the first time in history that a group of people held a march against themselves. Would that day have been better spent, offering an outward critique of the conditions and situations that cause, Black marginalization politically, Black poverty, the range of ills that, we've been combating for such a long time? Would all that time and energy and institutional building could have been better spent, offering an outward critique instead of an inward critique?
Sure. This might be a way of answering your question about the sort of swan song of Farrakhan's career, because I think that throughout the history, at least in the 20th century of the African-American experience, we've always had this debate around issues of poverty between structural issues that inform and shape poverty versus the behavioral issues that are sometimes outcomes, sometimes contributing factors to poverty. And so Farrakhan's position has been consistent throughout, which is self-help, which is in many ways to concede the fact that the structures of white supremacy are fairly permanent, and in that particular environment, Black men, Black women, Black families have to essentially do for themselves. That's actually part of the religious tenets of the Nation of Islam. Right. So that the extent to which that message gets across now is we understand that piece. That I think the reason why Farrakhan's messaging sometimes doesn't have the same impact is because we understand that piece. I think that Black folk, Black families, and Black men understand that there are going to be some permanent structures of racism, and in that environment, we need to be self-help oriented. Now, that cannot be the end-all be-all, because as we know, unless we're going to fight the powers that be, address the structural issues that shape poverty, then we're ultimately going to lose. And so I think now we need messaging that is a little bit more balanced. To be honest with you, Obama is the perfect sort of touchstone for that, because he does, I think, a very, very good job of holding our feet to the fire in terms of responsibility. It annoys people sometimes when he talks about Black fatherhood, right, when he talks about education, but in all honesty, he's right. But Obama, to the extent that he can, as the first Black president in white America, he does also understand that there are structural issues in place. So the people who speak out now, and I don't know if I agree with Mark so much that the march was a march against Black men. I think the march was a challenge to Black men. I don't think that Farrakhan was very preachy there at all in terms of wanting us to go back into the communities and talk about family and talk about atonement. If you think about things like domestic abuse, even now, but certainly then as well, or if you think about the fact that there are fathers and were fathers who abandon their children, then the message of atonement is not a severe critique, it's a challenge. it's a challenge for us to step up to the plate. So my interpretation of the march is probably shaped by the fact that I'm a little bit older than Mark Hill. I was a little bit closer to starting my own family and beginning my own economic success. I think Mark at that point in time was probably, he might have still even been in high school. He's a bit younger than I am. So I think depending upon how old you were might shape exactly how you
impacted. Yeah.
But I didn't feel criticized being there. I felt empowered.
Let me ask this question. I mean, you raised a point about the Nation of Islam's religious tenets, very conservative and traditional in many ways, particularly around the issue of gender. Yes. And clearly there was a part of the march that presumed that one of the things that was lacking in Black America was this idea that Black men needed to ascend to their rightful role as patriarchal leaders of the Black community. There, of course, has been a lot of criticism. There was a lot of criticism in response to that. A group of Black women activists and intellectuals met at Columbia University the night of the march. The historian E. Francis White has written incredibly about how the moment of the Million Man March almost reinscribes a moment of patriarchal leadership within the Black community. In 1995, when this march is going on, no one's talking hip-hop feminism.
That's right.
In 1995, and yet in 2010, that's something that's very much on the table and part of the lexicon of talking about hip-hop. Yeah. So for a moment, let's talk about where hip-hop has gone. Sure. Since 1995 to 2010, particularly around notions of gender and sexuality and the performance of Black masculinity.
Sure. Well, I don't know if the last 15 years are a good marker for hip-hop's potential to address some of these issues, because the market forces shape so much of the content of the music, at least in the mainstream. And so in the mainstream, I think we have devolved in terms of representation of women, and particularly in terms of the visual and video exploitation of women's bodies. And visual and video and fragmentation of women's bodies on video as well. So as the technology has enhanced and as the resources for making visual images have enhanced, we get things like tip drill. And so we've had this kind of tip drill moment in some ways where the fragmentation of women's bodies has become fodder for the capitalist machinery of hip hop culture. So it's a very complex and I think devolving sort of set of circumstances. But I think there is hope, because in the sort of earlier stages of this millennium, we've seen a lot of responses to that. We've seen a lot of hip hop culture critiquing itself. We've seen projects like John Legend and the Roots Wake Up, like a lot of collaborative projects that are geared towards more socially conscious music. So I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel for some of this. But the bottom line is the same patriarchy that existed, and I think the women who gathered at Columbia are absolutely right. The invisible patriarchy that kind of existed in the march itself played itself out in the lyrics and music of hip hop culture in the most sexist and the most sexually exploitative ways possible. Now we're starting to get some pushback. And as you well know, the women scholars of hip hop culture are extraordinary and amazing. The scholarly discourse is probably a little bit, and when I say a little bit, I mean maybe a couple hundred years ahead of women. Right? But that, to me, is a sign of hope in the sense that we can bring voices into the dialogue that can balance some of these things out. I don't think Nelly will ever make another tip drill, because not because he's more conscious, but because he understands that full stop, the community does not tolerate that. Right. Men, women, children, we're not tolerating that. And so people will always make that kind of music, and the 70 to 75% white buying audience of hip hop will usually consume Black exploitative imagery. But the Black community itself has already pushed back against some of these images. The scholars are leading, women scholars, Black women scholars are leading the charge in terms of critiquing the music. And I think we have a recipe now for being able to address these issues within the culture at the both academic level, at the street level, the music level, and even if you think about BET shows like Hip Hop in America, even at the populist level, we're attempting to address our issues of misogyny and patriarchy, and to me, that's an extremely healthy sign.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm host Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Professor James Peterson of Bucknell University, author of the forthcoming Major Figures, Repetition, Presence, and Discourse in Hip Hop Culture, University of Mississippi Press. If we go back to 1995 and look who's carrying the water for Black masculinity in hip hop. You mentioned Pac, Big, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Snoop. It's a distinct performance of Black masculinity. We go forward to 2010, and you're more likely to hear names like T.I., Kanye, Soulja Boy, Drake. Do you think we've seen some sort of progressive movement in terms of how black masculinity is packaged in hip hop. And I'm not necessarily talking about the content of the music. I mean, I think we understand lyrically where the music is. But I mean, I think in terms of the packaging of the men who present hip hop to the world, have we seen certain kind of progressions in terms of what kind of representations of black masculinity that we see in hip hop, you know, contemporarily?
I'm not sure if we would call it a progression. I mean, there has been some differentiation and some dissemination of different modes and models for black masculinity. And I think I like to look at Kanye, Wale, and Lupe. I know those names rhyme. Those are the three that I look at as carrying the water of a progressive black masculinity. Lupe Fiasco is the kind of artist who, through his videos and through his lyrics and through his music, is really demonstrating an alternative to what we think as traditional ghetto black masculinity. I mean, he's riding a skateboard and talking about his girlfriend.
Right.
He's riding past the drug dealers. He's not on the corner dealing the drugs, right? He's talking about his mom being a victim of those things, not that he sold his mother crack. That's different from what Biggie's talking about, right? You take someone like Wale, who's bringing an additional diasporic voice into it and is very, very conscious about what his background is and his distinction as a non-middle passage black, right? He brings that to us in his music. He also is attempting to articulate women's voices in his music. That's a little bit tricky. It's kind of a stopgap measure. You have some of these men like Kanye, Lupe, and Wale. They all voice dramatically women in their music. I call that the kind of gender stopgap. So we rather have the women's voices, but the marketplace squeezes those voices out to such an extent that we need some of our more progressive black male figures within hip hop to voice some of those concerns. They can do that, but it's a stopgap measure, right? So I think those three gentlemen, in terms of where they come from regionally, in the diaspora and also in America, in terms of the content of their music and in terms of the way they dress, their style, and just the ways in which they project masculinity are, for me, what's become more progressive now. And aside from Kanye, neither one of them are going to be platinum. None of those guys are going to be platinum consistently, but they are in the mainstream. They do drop records that people can buy. Their videos are on MTV and BET. And we actually, instead of always being negative and critiquing all the terrible stuff that's there, we actually have to use some of that energy and some of that discourse to prop up, support, and hold forth for those folk who are actually being progressive.
We're with James Peterson, Bucknell University professor. We're here on Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. Your father. And, you know, as many folks have been watching, their hearts breaking, you know, these number of cases where, you know, both women and men have been bullied, you know, over the last, you know, literally over the last couple of weeks. Many folks taking their own lives because of the kind of homophobic rhetoric that has come with some of this bullying. You know, how do you feel about, as a father, how do you, you know, process this reality with your own children? Both in terms of, you know, any kind of bullying that might be directed to them, but also if they happen to be the bulliers.
Sure. Well, as you probably know, you know, my children have suffered from some racial bullying from where we lived previously. And so I think that the bullying that we've seen in the media around sexual identity really strikes a chord with me. Not that we can equate racial identity and sexual identity, but I do see some commonality in the sense that because within our society it is tolerable to discriminate against certain groups, it becomes normalized within our communities. And so, for example, I'm really excited about what's happening with Don't Ask, Don't Tell in terms of the judge who's is essentially trying to hold it up so that we can actually eradicate it. I don't know how I feel about the fact that President Obama is deferring to the Senate on it, but I do know that if we're going to have this conversation, if we're going to talk about all these bullies in schools, and we're going to try to, you know, legislate against that and create municipal policies about how to deal with bullying for sexual identity, then we really have to start at the top. We have to model what it is we want to see. We can't have a policy in the United States military that is essentially a policy that bullies people who are gay and lesbian in our own military and then expect for young people in high schools and middle schools to somehow take a different path. So I think these things are directly related. I wish that in the media we could connect them more, that we've got to have a national model where Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which is in effect bullying gay and lesbian people in our armed forces. You know, people who serve and protect us, we're bullying the people who serve and protect us. We need to connect that discourse, that discussion, and that policy making to the more communal grassroots piece, because then we don't look like hypocrites. Right now, if we're talking to bullies in high schools and middle schools, we can do that, and we should, and we need to address it. I personally have a zero tolerance for bullying. I will hold any institution which my children are in to a zero tolerance policy for bullying, which means if someone bullies my child, I will be in your school, spit and flame the day of. Zero tolerance. But we cannot have those kinds of conversations and respond that way without addressing what's going on nationally. Don't ask, don't tell's got to go.
Yeah, we're with James Peterson, professor of English, Bucknell University. I'm Anthony Neal. You're watching Left to Black. And let me get you one last question, since it's a hot topic. You had a chance to read Aaliyah King's article, The Mean Girls of Morehouse, talking about the Plastics, the group of young men who've been challenging, I think in many ways, the status quo of the performance of black masculinity at a place like Morehouse. What are your thoughts about the performances that the young men are doing in order to challenge the status quo, and what has been the response, not only from the institution, this being Morehouse College, but the larger community, which has not been very supportive, to be quite honest. Yeah.
This is very similar to the bullying piece. Morehouse invited this kind of resistance by instituting the policy about dress code, right? I mean, they were very, very specific. You can't, I don't remember exact wording of it, but you can't wear heels, and you cannot in any way dress
like a woman, right?
Like a woman.
Right.
So I think they invited this kind of resistance in that. And it's interesting, I don't, as a cultural critic, I don't want to tell a private institution how they should, construct their...
And that's an interesting point, because, I've heard people say this all the time. Morehouse is a private institution, and yes, it is, right? But it's also one of the founding critical institutions of the black community. Morehouse has never been just a private institution, right? Yeah, Morehouse and Spelman and many of these HBCUs have been black American institutions, because they've been so important in terms of framing the public view of what blackness is. And by the same token, I think they owe it or have a responsibility to allow black America to speak back to them about how it represents us, going forward.
Yes, I mean, well, here's the bottom line. While I wouldn't tell them how to assign their dress codes, what I would say to them is that HBCUs have received a tremendous amount of cultural and economic capital from the black community over the course of their existence. And one of the charges of the black community, from all of our leaders, from Farrakhan to MLK, to Harriet Tubman, has been to lead the charge on certain moral issues. I'm sorry, the people think that the whole idea of sexual identity is kind of a religious moral issue. I think it's just a human moral issue that we've got to really be more accepting. And you know what? As crazy as it sounds, the African American community has so much more to gain by being progressive about this. We have so much more to gain by because we can ill afford to lose any of our human resources. So we cannot chastise, alienate, and expel members of our community who, throughout the history of our experience here, have been at the forefront of every movement. They're at the forefront of every religious movement, the forefront of every social movement, forefront of every political movement.
Artistic movement,
Artistic movement. You just don't know that what sexual identity is. So what I would want to say to the president of Morehouse is, you're getting bogged down in the kind of issue that misses the point. The point is that the African American community has an opportunity to lead here. The hip hop generation has an opportunity to lead here. And this issue of sexual identity is not going anywhere. Why can't we look at Eddie Long and understand that we could point our finger at Eddie Long and blame him and bring him down and make all the jokes, but why can't we ask the question, what community produced Eddie Long? Why are we the community that forces our leaders to repress their sexual identity? So this has got to stop. And again, I don't care about your dress code. Make your dress code what you want it to be, but you should make your environment, lead by making your environment in which people of all different kinds of identities can exist. Until then, you're going to get the resistance.
The funny thing is, there are folks who always make the connection between the way that you dress and the way that you perform. And the idea that, young men at Spelman, young men at Morehouse or young women at Spelman are modeling success in a certain kind of way. You teach at Bucknell, you've taught in the Pennsylvania state system, you did your graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania, undergrad work at Duke. I teach here at Duke. you know, you've been in 8 o'clock in the morning classes.
That's right.
Where students are walking in with sweatshirts on and pajamas and,
yes.
you know, not $8 flip-flops, but the $2 flip-flops.
That's right.
And no one ever wants to make a connection between their sartorial choices
That's right.
and what they're intellectually capable of.
That's
And
exactly.
so you have to wonder what it is about, you know, this image of respectability in Black America that in 2010, we're literally still playing that same kind of visual politics. Sure.
Listen, the burden of representation is imploding on us. The burden of representation is imploding on us. We can no longer live in the civil rights era. I can understand the political strategy of certain sartorial choices in order to humanize Black folk in a moment where Black folk are being dehumanized categorically in so many different ways.
Right.
Now we just have to embrace our humanity, the diversity of it. We don't have to represent it in a way that's modeled and molded by white supremacist historical America. We now have to kind of chart our own course. And so this is an excellent example you're bringing up, because you're right. No one's dressing up at Bucknell, but they're still getting the jobs and having the access and success that people think we should be achieving and attaining within the African American community. It's not going to be your sartorial choices. It will be your social, political, economic, and educational choices. Morehouse has got to understand that their education is much more important and much more valuable than what clothes they tell their students to wear.
You've been watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined by Professor James Peterson of Bucknell University, author of the forthcoming Major Figures, Repetition, Presence, and the Discourse of Hip-Hop Culture, University of Mississippi Press. Thanks for coming on board, James. Looking forward to talking to you again, and take care.
Yes, sir. You do the same. Take care.
It's what we decided we wanted to be. It's like, whenever I get into these discussions about what happened after the Million Man March, I say, what did you do? You know, it's not about what the march did. What Reverend Chavis and Farrakhan did was brought us all together so that, one, we know that we can come together and do stuff. I think a lot of alliances came out of that march. I think some lasting relationships came out of that march that have produced maybe some businesses or even some community initiatives that we don't even know about. I think one of the things about the march is that we didn't know the names of all 100, all million men that came together, but we did see that we were together there. So I think that one of the things that came out of it is that you can go do your thing and you're part of a body, part of a family, and you don't have to be known to do it. You can just be there and get it done. And a lot of people, I think that's what they're doing. I've heard of a lot of people that have started different businesses, some nonprofits, community outreach, some just plain old guys that are more involved after that march. So I think it was a call to action. I think some people answered the call.
Well, I think that we've got a better sense of community, and people are taking, they're taking more pride in helping each other. And I just see that it's a movement that continues. It's not just like that happened and it's all over with, but we're continuing to move from that point. And I see us as a people trying to mobilize ourselves more to get things done instead of just sitting back and complaining about it.
Really can't say, but I remember when people came right back after the march, people were very enthused, very wanted to do things in the community. It's been a long time, and so I don't really know what the aftermath was. I was one of those people who didn't attend the march. I had job commitments, I had family commitments, and I think that I already was striving for the goals of the Million Man March. From my understanding, I think Minister Farrakhan and the other organizers wanted the people, especially black people, black men, to make a commitment to their families, make a commitment to their communities, and I had already made that commitment.
I'm Mark Anthony Neal, and you're watching Left of Black. We are joined now by Mr. Rashod Ollison, former music critic for the Baltimore Sun, current of the Virginian Pilot, where he is a blogger and a critic. How are you doing today, Rashod?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing good. I thought we'd have you come on to figure out how you're processing the state of black music these days. What are you listening to?
I find myself listening to a lot of older music.
Mm-hmm.
lot of crate digging because, you know, it seems, especially the black music that's being pumped through the mainstream, there seems to be this kind of ambiguity going on. Like the artist not sure where they're really trying to go, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because there's some adventurous stuff out there.
Yeah.
But I just, a lot of it, especially what I get inundated with, is awesome. And I also write for Jet, so people send me stuff to pitch. So a lot of it that's coming through the mainstream is just, I don't, it leaves me cold, really does. And even some of the stuff that's on the fringes, I got like the new Bilal record.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes, you know, they're so talented, I think they try to do way too much. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with streamlining it a little bit. And he's one of those artists whom I think, wow, he's talented, but he tries to do too much. And it's interesting with a lot of those types of artists, how they're sort of trying to meld a lot of what they call, I guess, you know, they're trying to get out of what is black, you know, which I think is another issue, you know, because I think, you know, right now that's a lot of black artists are trying to redefine what black music is by folding in a lot of sort of French influences from like rock groups like Radiohead and even digging deep into people like Talking Heads who were copying black music in the first place. So, you know, it's a strange time. So personally, I find myself rediscovering a lot of the older stuff that were on the fringes in the 70s, which, strange enough, I find informs for me a lot of what I'm hearing now.
Yeah.
It's strange, but I just find myself crate digging quite a lot these days.
You know, one of the things I find really interesting, if you had to look for a face for black male R&B and a face of black female R&B, you know, you probably would not be too far off if the face of black female R&B was Mary J. Blige, and the male face was R. Kelly. And what does it say that two artists, you know, who collectively have been on the scene for almost 40 years, you know, if you combine both of their time in the industry, you know, Mary J. Blige is in her late 30s, R. Kelly's in his early 40s, you know, what does it say about the contemporary state of R&B music that these veterans, you know, still that the younger cats are still very much catching up to these veterans?
You know, that's interesting because my next assignment is a column that, you know, sort of glances off of Mary's career. She was just here in Virginia Beach about 2 weeks ago, and I reviewed her show, and I just found her career really, really interesting, and that how she evolved from, she was straight up thugged out, you know, in 1992 when she came out.
She was a female Puffy. I mean, that's the best way to describe it.
You know what? And I think she was harder than Puffy. You know, like, but you know, it's interesting that you know, to see her evolution. It's a beautiful one, but musically, I find her so boring these days because a lot of what I see what she's trying to do, and that, you know, she's a grown woman, she's almost 40, she's not there yet, and, you know, trying to have, you know, she's putting herself out here musically as a sort of you know, encouraging young people, young women to be, you know, better, I love myself, sort of this Oprah-esque type inspirational stuff, which is fine, but it just feels so kind of forced to me. But then a lot of her production on her newer records are so trendy, you know, that it's like, you know, Mary, you were, I don't know. She's still out there and she gets a lot of respect, but I noticed at a concert here 2 weeks ago, the crowd was more people her age and older. It wasn't too many young women in the crowd.
And they wanted to hear the older stuff, right?
And they wanted to hear Be Happy, and they wanted to hear I'm Going Down. I mean, they got the most response. And in fact, I think she knows that because throughout her show, which was a great show, in fact, it was 2 hours, but it was mostly everything she did before 2000.
Okay. Yeah.
But with R. Kelly, though, it's interesting with him because, you know, he was instrumental in kind of bringing this really crude type image to R&B balladeer.
Right.
And we've seen people like Trey Songz and Chris Brown and Usher run with that, which I think has done more harm than good. Because if you know, you just have a lot of these, you know, what I call these mannish boys singers out here who are just, I'm sexy, come into my sex room, Trey Songz thing, and it's like, I don't even buy it, They try to sell freak factor, but it's not freaky. It's more like an 8th grade managed boy who needs to slap upside his head. So,
you mentioned the managed boy piece, and we had talked back over the summer when you were working on the great pieces that you did on Prince, for Jet Magazine and also for the online site. What is it about Prince that after all these years, I mean, the first Prince album is 1978, that he still has an allure, and you make the argument in the piece that no one really does sexy like Prince does, right? Even as he's retreated from being a sexual artist in many kinds of ways.
Yeah, he's I think right now Prince is pretty much riding off a legend that he established 20 years ago, and he doesn't push his music too much these days to the edge where like he did back in the 80s. But it's still, I think I quoted you in the Jet piece where you say even in his sleep he's still 90% more riskier than a lot of folks out there, which is true. But that's because Prince is a true musician in the truest sense of the word. He plays his instruments. He understands music, how to put it together. These days, a lot of the artists aren't musicians. They don't play the music. They program it, but they don't play it. So I think that's the difference in how you approach music and how you put it all together. And he's still doing interesting stuff musically, but it's not with the same sort of fervor and the same sort of sexuality, hot sexuality he had in the back in the 80s, but which is to be expected because Prince is past 50 now, and it just you just can't do it like that when you're 50. Not like you would do, not in the same way. So I don't even expect him to come back as as sexy. Sexy should be redefined for somebody like that. But now he's such a go hard Jehovah's Witness. I don't think we're gonna expect anything remotely from Prince these days. Which, I think is fine because he's settled into his religion. He's 50. He's evolved. He's doing, things musically that are, a little bit more interesting. He puts in a little bit more jazz elements in his productions now, which, you didn't have from Prince, before. So that I don't expect him to be sexy no more.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today with Rashod Ollison of the Virginian Pilot, where he's a music critic, former music critic for the Baltimore Sun, also a contributor to Jet Magazine. I want to switch gears a little bit. When the story broke a few weeks ago, or last week, Aaliyah Keene's essay on the Mean Girls of Morehouse, you had a lot of comments on Facebook in response to it, and a very interesting kind of perception of the situation from someone who was interested in going to Morehouse, who applied to Morehouse, but then decided to put the brakes on. Can you talk about, what you felt about Morehouse, as a young man applying to the school, a decade ago?
I just felt that wasn't for me. I'm not a conservative person. I wasn't raised in a conservative family. And, Morehouse, although even at that time, and I still do, have a lot of respect for what it represented and how it trained black men of a certain era, I just felt like in the early to mid 90s when I was looking at it that it didn't fit me. And I'm glad I didn't go because it just wasn't, I didn't go to a historically black college. I support them. I have nothing disparaging to say about them. Let me just put that out there. But it just wasn't for me because I grew up in a very militant, very proud black family, and I needed diversity when I was getting ready to go to school because it was too black in my house, black in my neighborhood, and I was like, there are other folks outside of black folks, and so I needed that when I got ready to go to college. But in regards to the Mean Girls thing, first of all, I thought the title to that the headline to that article was very condescending and mean-spirited in itself. Because they may have false eyelashes on and makeup, but these are not girls, and they didn't refer to themselves as girls. So I thought that headline was not right.
Misleading, right, sensational, right.
But I think for these guys, who want to dress that way and want to identify themselves that way, I think there's a lot of things going on just with that because I wonder, I have friends and we talk about this with those, and these young guys who, you know, they are gay, but I think they sort of think of, I don't know if it's right to think just because they're dressing as women as some way to identify as being gay.
Right.
To me, that has nothing to do with their sexuality.
Right.
You know, and I find just on a personal level that drag to be kind of boring because it doesn't have any of the ironic and, you know, fascinating aesthetic layers that people like Sylvester brought to drag. So I just think, you know, y'all are just imitating hollow women, you know, which, you know, is boring to me. But I find that these guys, I mean, the beauty of the civil rights movement and all those people dying and making ways for others, that we had choices. Back when Morehouse was founded, where else could we go? Where else could black people go? You have choice, and with these guys, I mean, that institution isn't going to change. Should it change? Does it need to change? I don't know. But the freedom is the beautiful thing. I hope these guys realize is they don't have to pay that high tuition to get mistreated and marginalized. They can be their liberal selves at liberal art colleges, wear makeup, wear the Beyonce weeds, whatever they want to do somewhere else. You don't have to support an institution that doesn't support you. That's the beauty of being black now. You have choices.
Well, thank you, Rashod, for that commentary. You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We've been joined this afternoon by Rashod Ollison of the Virginian Pilot, where he's a music critic, former music critic for the Baltimore Sun, and currently a contributor also for Jet Magazine.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.